In the lantern-lit muddy alleys of Edo's Yoshiwara district, a deal is being struck. The merchandise isn't silk, it isn't spice. It's a severed pinky finger carefully wrapped in paper, a grotesque token of absolute devotion. This isn't just a gruesome back-alley transaction. It is a love letter written in blood, a desperate act of passion in a society engineered for absolute, suffocating order. Welcome to the Cursed Chamber, where we find that the most perfect social blueprints often hide the most grotesque design flaws. We're examining the Tokugawa shogunate, a 250-year social experiment in total control. It was a civilization designed to run with the chilling precision of a clockwork machine, where every citizen was a gear, every action was scripted, and every unsanctioned emotion was a flaw in the system. Harmony was the goal, and order was the god. So how did this perfectly calibrated machine of a society spiral into such bizarre pathologies? How did a culture obsessed with discipline produce a black market for amputated fingers? A suicide craze celebrated as the ultimate romance, and an untouchable class of people who could be murdered without consequence. Before we begin the autopsy on this clockwork society, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you hearing this story? I love knowing our community spans every corner of the globe, all of us drawn to those moments when official history cracks under the pressure of human truth. It turns out the curse haunting Edo, Japan wasn't some fox spirit or vengeful ghost. The curse was the design. It was the system itself, a perfectly constructed prison that squeezed human nature so tightly it forced madness to become the only sane escape. To understand the madness that bloomed in Edo, Japan, you must first appreciate the chilling perfection of its design. The Tokugawa shogunate wasn't merely a government, it was an architectural blueprint for an entire civilization. Its goal was a society free from the chaos of war and the unpredictability of change. A nation sealed under glass, beautiful, static, and utterly controlled. For 2.5 centuries, it almost worked. The project began not with soldiers and swords, but with contracts and ceremonies, starting with the most fundamental human bond, marriage. At first glance, the system appeared entirely reasonable, a cornerstone of stability in a world that had known nothing but war. In the privileged world of the samurai, love was a dangerous indulgence. Marriage was a matter of statecraft. A union was not the joining of two hearts, but the merger of two households, a strategic alliance that required the full approval of the family clans, the domain lord, and sometimes the shogun himself. The process was called omiai, and it was governed by a cold, practical calculus known as aigara, the compatibility of family status. Imagine a young woman in a silent, polished room. She has spent her life mastering poetry, the tea ceremony, and the art of graceful movement. She is then presented with a scroll of paper. On it is the name of a man she has never met, a man whose honor, failings, and future are now legally bound to her own. Her personal feelings are irrelevant, an inconvenient variable in an equation of power, land, and lineage. She is now a signature on a document, a beautifully wrapped asset transferred from one ledger to another. This was the first gear in the great machine, the gentle, almost imperceptible sacrifice of personal will for the promise of collective peace. It seemed a small price to pay, but a society built on contracts requires every party to know their precise role, their unchangeable function. And so, the social architecture expanded. The Tokugawa regime perfected a 4-tiered caste system, a rigid pyramid of human value known as the Shinokosho. At the apex were the samurai, the warrior administrators, the soul and mind of Japan. Below them were the farmers, the backbone who fed the nation. Then came the artisans, the hands who built and crafted. At the very bottom were the merchants whose work with money was considered parasitic, a necessary but undignified stain on the social fabric. The official narrative was one of harmony. Each class performed its essential function, creating a perfectly balanced, self-sustaining organism. It was a beautiful, elegant theory. The reality was far grubbier. The farmers, who constituted 80% of the population and were officially second in status, were systematically bled dry. The samurai, forbidden from commerce, were paid in fixed stipends of rice. To fund their existence, the lords imposed a crushing tax burden on the peasantry. Picture a village headman, his face etched with worry, bowing before a samurai tax collector. He is handing over not just rice, but the stored energy of his community, the calories that would have seen them through the winter, the small surplus that might have protected them from a failed harvest. He does this in the name of duty of his designated function within the great machine. Behind the polite language of tribute and social obligation was the grim reality of systemic poverty, of children with swollen bellies, of a quiet, gnawing hunger that became the permanent background noise of rural life. The cost of order was rising. The loss was no longer just a matter of choice, it was a matter of survival. A system this rigid doesn't just define who belongs, it must with surgical precision define who does not. If the four castes were the structure of the building, there had to be a sewer beneath it. This was the role of the Burakumin, or Ita, the untouchables. Their existence was a necessary stain, a class of people deemed congenitally unclean, because their professions involved death, butchers, tanners, executioners, and undertakers. They were legally human, but socially erased, forced to live in segregated hamlets, denied basic rights, and treated as a source of moral contamination. A samurai could, under certain pretexts, cut one down with little fear of reprisal. They were ghosts in their own land, their humanity nullified by a line drawn in the cultural imagination. This obsession with purity soon scaled up from the village to the nation itself. In the 17th century, the shogunate initiated sakoku, the chained country policy. Japan's borders were sealed. No one was allowed in, and no Japanese subject was allowed out upon penalty of death. The stated reason was to protect Japan from the corrupting influence of foreign powers, particularly the Christian missionaries who followed in the wake of Portuguese traders. The crackdown was brutal. To root out hidden believers, officials implemented the fumi-e, a ritual of psychological torture. Suspected Christians were forced to publicly step on an image of Jesus or the Virgin Mary. To refuse was to confess, and to confess was to be sentenced to a gruesome death by crucifixion or burning. Imagine the internal horror. To save your physical body, you were forced to trample upon your own soul, to perform an act of ultimate betrayal against the God you worshipped in secret. The system was no longer content with managing your marriage or your livelihood. It now demanded access to your spirit, asserting its authority, not just over your life, but over your salvation. The walls of the cage had become absolute. But the final, most perfect expression of this clockwork order was found in the places where the system managed humanity's most primal chaotic urges, desire, and death. In the city of Edo, the shogunate created the Yoshiwara, the licensed pleasure quarter. This was not a chaotic den of vice. It was a state-regulated containment facility for human lust. Surrounded by high walls and a moat with a single guarded gate, it was a beautiful, glittering prison. Here, the daughters of impoverished families were sold into indentured servitude, their humanity exchanged for a contract. The system was designed with bureaucratic efficiency. Girls were medically inspected, registered, and ranked. Their lives were a grim performance of artifice and exploitation, serving the very samurai and merchants whose social rules made their existence necessary. The average life expectancy for a woman inside these walls was 22 years. Syphilis, forced abortions, and despair were the silent business partners in this state-sanctioned enterprise. The machine had learned to commodify desire, to put a price on intimacy and regulate it like any other trade good. And if desire was managed with such precision, so too was death. For the samurai class, the ultimate expression of control was the ritual of seppuku. This was not merely suicide, it was a state-sanctioned, highly choreographed act of self-annihilation. When a samurai failed in his duty or brought shame upon his lord, he could be ordered to disembowel himself. It was a command performance, a final bloody demonstration of his submission to the code of honor. His personal will was irrelevant. His life was not his own to end, but a tool of the state to be disposed of with maximum symbolic impact. For the women of samurai families, there was a parallel ritual jigai. When a household was disgraced or a husband condemned to seppuku, his wife was expected to follow him in death. But her act was to be different, quick and decorous. She would tie her legs together to ensure a dignified posture in death, then cut her own throat. The system in its infinite cruelty dictated not only that she must die, but how she must die, policing her final moments to ensure they complied with a masculine ideal of honor. Here, the machine's logic reached its terrifying conclusion. It had transformed the most intimate and final acts of human existence, love, sex, and death, into functions of state policy. Life was a role to be played, and death was the final scripted line. The journey from a simple marriage contract to a wife's ritualized suicide was not a sudden leap into barbarism. It was a slow, logical progression paved with reasonable-sounding decrees. The genius of the system was its impeccable, terrifying logic. The horror was that its logic was fundamentally inhuman, and the labels from stability to harmony to honor always stayed polite. Every perfectly designed system carries the seeds of its own destruction. For the Tokugawa shogunate, the fatal flaw wasn't an invading army or a peasant rebellion. It was a simple, elegant, and catastrophic miscalculation. The narrative of how this clockwork society began to bleed isn't a story of war, but of Ledger's poems and the quiet, creeping horror of a world turned upside down. The architects of the Pax Tokugawa built their world on a foundation of pure, unshakable honor. The samurai, the ruling class, were defined by their sword and their loyalty. They were warriors, philosophers, and administrators whose hands were to be kept clean from the grime of commerce. Money was a tool for lesser men, a vulgar necessity. They stood above. For over a century, this noble arrangement held. The samurai oversaw a nation at peace, their blades resting in polished scabbards, their days governed by intricate rituals that reinforced their moral and social superiority. They had won the war and designed the peace. They had no enemies left to fight, or so they thought. The real enemy wasn't an army carrying banners and spears. It was an idea multiplying silently in the backrooms of the cities they governed. While the samurai practiced the art of the sword, the merchant class, officially the lowest rung on the social ladder, was mastering a far more potent art arithmetic. In the bustling markets of Osaka and the sprawling new metropolis of Edo, the merchants built a parallel empire. It was an empire of currency, of credit, of futures markets for rice they bought cheap from desperate farmers and sold dear to the increasingly desperate samurai. While the warrior class was bound by a fixed income, a hereditary stipend of rice whose value could plummet with a single good harvest, the merchants swam in a river of fluid capital. They were scorned in public and bowed to in private, becoming the secret bankers of the very elites who despised them. The humiliation was a slow-acting poison. A samurai whose ancestors had carved their names into the pages of history with steel now found himself pawning his family's ancestral armor to a man he wouldn't deign to speak to in the street. The power dynamic of Japan was quietly hemorrhaging not on a battlefield, but across the lacquered counters of pawn shops. The merchants held the contracts, the deeds, and the debt. The samurai were left with nothing but their beautiful, useless swords and the crushing weight of their own magnificent irrelevance. A sensible person, a sensible class, would recognize the existential threat and adapt. They would pivot. The samurai did not. Their code, the very source of their identity, had become their cage. With their finances in ruins and their purpose in life dissolving, the samurai sought escape. And the system in its paradoxical wisdom had provided officially sanctioned release valves. The first was the floating world, the glittering transient reality of the pleasure quarters. Inside the walled district of the Yoshiwara, the rigid caste system blurred. Here, a samurai's status was worthless without a merchant's coin. It was a world of borrowed time and purchased affection, where a warrior could shed the armor of his obligations for a few hours of sake music and the company of a woman trained in the art of making a man feel powerful, even as his world crumbled. But this was only a temporary anesthetic. The true escape, the one that would infect the soul of the nation, was found in the dark, crowded theaters of the city. There, the playwright Chikamatsu Monzaemon was staging a revolution. His kabuki and bunraku puppet plays told stories that the official culture had outlawed, stories of authentic, passionate, and doomed love. The heroes of these plays were not mighty samurai. They were clerks, merchants, and artisans. The heroines were not noblewomen. They were courtesans, prostitutes, and the wives of other men. They were stories of the Giri-Ninjo conflict, the brutal clash between social obligation Giri and human-feeling Ninjo. In Chikamatsu's world, love was not a polite arrangement. It was a force of nature, a beautiful, tragic disease for which the only cure was death, and the audience was spellbound. In the flickering candlelight, they watched star-crossed lovers, a paper merchant and a courtesan, a vegetable grocer and another man's wife, navigate a world that forbade their happiness. The plays always ended the same way. Trapped by a system that offered no hope, the lovers would make a final pact. They would bind themselves together and commit shinju, a double suicide, a journey to the next life where they believed their love could finally be realized. This wasn't just entertainment, it was a cultural contagion. The stories resonated so deeply with a populace suffocating under the weight of endless rules that they began to seep into reality. Young couples, their own affections thwarted by the iron walls of caste and family, saw shinju not as a tragedy, but as a beautiful, romantic, and defiant act of self-determination. The ultimate protest against an unfeeling system was to leave it all together hand in hand. A wave of copycat suicides began to sweep through the cities. When love is impossible in life, people start seeking it in death. And it wasn't long before the government, the master architects of order, decided they had to intervene. The shogunate reacted with the cold, bureaucratic fury of an engineer who sees his perfect machine malfunctioning. This romantic glorification of suicide was a direct assault on the Neo-Confucian values of duty and perseverance that underpinned their entire society. It was a dangerous emotional virus, and it had to be eradicated. The crackdown was swift and clinical. First, they banned the most popular shinju plays. The stories that had captivated a nation were now contraband. But that wasn't enough. To strip the glamour from the act itself, the authorities issued a series of brutal edicts. The bodies of lovers who committed shinju were to be denied proper funeral rites. Their corpses were to be put on display, like those of common criminals, to be mocked and shamed. If one of the lovers survived, they would be charged with the murder of the other and exiled, their life systematically destroyed. The state was sending a clear message. Your feelings are a crime, and your tragedy will be rewritten as a sordid public disgrace. But the machine made another miscalculation. By trying to legislate emotion, it only made the forbidden fruit more desirable. The state's cruelty inadvertently added another layer of tragic romance to the act. The lovers weren't just escaping an uncaring society, they were now martyrs, defying a tyrannical government, even in death. The desperation now denied its grand theatrical exit, festered and mutated into something even more bizarre. The new stage for this desperate theater of the heart was the pleasure quarter itself. In the hyper-competitive and emotionally charged world of the Yoshiwara, a courtesan's vows of love were her stock in trade, but they were also suspect. Was her affection real or just part of the service? How could she prove in a world where everything was for sale that her devotion was priceless? She did it with a knife. The practice of yubikiri or finger-cutting emerged as the ultimate irrefutable proof of sincerity. A courtesan would sever the top of her own pinky finger and present it to her most favored client as a pledge of undying love. A written oath could be burned, a promise could be broken, but a severed finger was a permanent, horrifying testament. It was a sacrifice of her own body to prove the truth of her heart. This final grotesque act revealed the system's total failure. A society that had suppressed all healthy outlets for love had created a culture where self-mutilation became the most profound romantic gesture. It spawned a grim black market where a woman could buy a finger from a beggar or a corpse to avoid cutting off her own. The shogunate, in its quest for perfect order, had created a world so twisted that a marketplace for severed human digits felt like a logical development. The clockwork machine was still running, but its gears were now slick with blood and jammed with the debris of broken human hearts. The system of perfect control had finally produced the most uncontrollable acts of all. Case file, the Edo paradox. Let's begin the autopsy. The official history reads like a glowing obituary. It tells us the Tokugawa shogunate, after 250 years of glorious stability, succumbed to external pressures, the arrival of American gunboats, and the unstoppable march of modernity. The official cause of death was contact with the outside world, but any good forensic historian knows that the official cause is rarely the whole story. The patient was sick long before the final diagnosis was made. The decay was internal systemic, and the evidence has been hiding in plain sight all along. To find the truth, we must set aside the sanitized histories and examine the artifacts that the period in its feverish decline left behind. The official story, the one the shogunate told itself, was of a golden age of peace and cultural flourishing. It was a society in perfect harmony, a testament to the wisdom of its architects, a beautiful story and a complete fiction. To see why, we need only look at our first piece of evidence. Look closely. See the faces of the doomed lovers, the humble soy sauce clerk, Tokubei, and the courtesan, Ohatsu. Their expressions are not of fear, but of tragic, resolute purpose. To the modern eye, it's a piece of art. To an audience in 18th century Edo, this was a headline, a viral sensation. This was not cultural preservation. This was the era's most powerful form of mass media, and its message was dangerously subversive. For a century, the people of Japan had been told that their lives were defined by giri social obligation. Their duty to their family, their lord, and their class was the supreme virtue. But this play, and hundreds like it, whispered a different, intoxicating gospel, the gospel of ninjo, of human feeling. It told millions of people that their personal heartaches, their forbidden desires, and their desperate love mattered. It argued that in a world that denied them happiness, a shared death was the most profound expression of freedom. This exhibit demolishes the myth of a harmonious society. A content and stable populace does not flock to theaters to weep for lovers who choose suicide over conformity. This was a culture starved of emotional oxygen, and these plays were the only air they were allowed to breathe. The system wasn't creating contentment, it was manufacturing a deep, collective yearning for an escape it could never permit. But art only reflects the sickness. It doesn't diagnose the underlying disease. For that, we must follow the money. The calligraphy is elegant, the columns are neat, but this is a brutal document. It's a record of loans made to samurai families. And look at the collateral. Here a set of ceremonial armor passed down for 10 generations. Here a collection of priceless swords, the very soul of the samurai. And here the deed to a family's last remaining rice paddies. This ledger is the system's true power structure, stripped of all ceremony and pretense. While the samurai were on top of the official social pyramid, this document proves that the pyramid was an illusion. The real power in Japan no longer flowed from the shogun's castle. It flowed from the merchant's counting house. The samurai, with their fixed rice stipends and a code that forbade them from touching money, were walking anachronisms in an economy they had created but refused to understand. Their legendary honor had become a fatal economic liability. This exhibit proves that the samurai class was not a ruling elite in control of its own destiny. They were debtors. They were clients. Their authority was being systematically dismantled, not by an enemy they could face on the battlefield, but by the quiet, relentless logic of a balance sheet. The foundation of their world was eroding beneath their feet, and the only thing holding them up was the credit extended by the men they officially despised. With their culture in open rebellion and their finances in ruins, how did the master architects of control respond? By doing what all failing systems do, they tried to outlaw the symptoms. The language is cold, formal, and radiates panic. It officially bans plays that use the term shinju. It forbids them from being staged. More than that, it details with chilling precision the official protocol for the bodies of real-life love-suicide victims. No funerals, no honors. Their naked corpses were to be laid out on straw mats at a crossroads, displayed for 3 days like animal carcasses, a warning to any who would dare to put their feelings before their duty. This is not the act of a confident government. This is the flailing of a regime terrified that it has lost control of the story. You cannot make a feeling illegal. You cannot censor a tragedy. that lives in the hearts of your people. In this desperate attempt to legislate emotion, the shogunate revealed its own profound weakness. It could command a warrior to disembowel himself with a blade, but it could not stop a clerk and a prostitute from finding a twisted form of salvation in each other's arms. This document is the system admitting that its control was never absolute. Its stability was a brittle facade ready to shatter at the first touch of genuine, unregulated human passion. So the autopsy is complete. The exhibits are on the table. What killed the old world of the samurai? What was the true nature of the curse? The curse was the system itself. It was the lethal interaction between an undeniable human need for love, for agency, for a life that is more than a pre-written script, and a social and economic machine so rigid that it denied all of it. The Tokugawa shogunate was a pressure cooker with all the valves welded shut. When the pressure became unbearable, the machine didn't just fail. It exploded in the most grotesque ways imaginable. The bizarre pathologies of Edo Japan weren't bugs in the system, they were features. They were the logical, if horrifying, outcome of a world that left no room for the human soul. In a society that denies you any voice, a shared suicide becomes a political statement. In a culture that commodifies love, a severed finger becomes the only believable proof of sincerity. These acts were not madness. They were the last desperate screams of humanity from inside a perfect, beautiful, and utterly inhuman cage. We step out of the chamber, the scent of ink from old ledgers and the ghostly echo of a shamisen fading behind us. The autopsy is over. The case file on the Edo paradox can now be closed, and the verdict is as clear as it is unsettling. The grotesque pathologies of Tokugawa Japan, the romantic suicides, the ritual self-mutilation, the marketplace for human flesh, were not the result of a system in chaos. They were the direct, inevitable consequence of a system of perfect order. The shogunate's 2.5-century masterpiece of social engineering wasn't just a government. It was a pressure cooker designed with impeccable skill and screwed down so tightly that not a single ounce of dissent or unregulated emotion could escape. The architects of this world failed to account for one crucial volatile ingredient: human nature itself. In a world that denies you any say in your own life, the manner of your death becomes your final, defiant masterpiece. In a culture that turns love into a transaction, offering a piece of your own body becomes the only currency of authentic feeling. These were not acts of madness. They were the last desperate screams of humanity from within the gears of a flawless machine. They were a testament to the fact that the human spirit would rather destroy itself in a blaze of feeling than suffocate quietly in a world of perfect, empty harmony. The curse of Edo Japan was its own relentless, inhuman logic. The echoes of that logic and the rebellion against it shaped the world that came after. When American warships arrived in 1853, they are often credited with shattering Japan's isolation and ending the age of the samurai. But the truth is, they were merely pushing on a door that was already rotten to the core. The Tokugawa shogunate didn't fall because of foreign cannons. It collapsed because its own internal contradictions had hollowed it out from the inside, leaving a beautiful but brittle shell. And who were the architects of the new Japan, the leaders of the Meiji Restoration, that hurled the nation into the modern world? In a final perfect irony, they were the very men the old system had failed and marginalized. They were the ambitious lower-ranked samurai who possessed the warrior spirit, but none of the wealth, their honor tarnished by debts to the merchant class. And they were the merchants themselves who held all the nation's real wealth, but were denied any of its respect. The system had inadvertently created its own executioners, empowering the very classes it was designed to suppress. This central tension, the ghost of the Edo paradox, never truly left Japan. It echoes today in the nation's complex identity, in the seamless blend of ancient tradition and hypermodernity, in the profound emphasis on group harmony that coexists with a fierce private individualism. You can hear it in the silent pressure of the workplace, which gave birth to the concept of karoshi, or death from overwork. You see it in the cultural distinction between tadamai, the polite public face one presents to society, and harm the true feelings one keeps locked away. The struggle between the demands of the perfect system and the needs of the individual soul continues, just in a different costume. And this is the universal lesson that echoes out from this specific chamber in history. It is a warning. Every society, every corporation, every ideology that dreams of creating a perfect, frictionless, and totally controlled system is dreaming of a cage. And when you build a cage that is perfect, you must remember that the only way out is to break yourself. History is a museum of such cages, each one built with the best of intentions and the most plausible of mistakes. We look back at the bloody, bizarre symptoms of Edo Japan and call it history. But it is also a mirror. It forces us to ask, what pressures are we living under? What parts of our own humanity are we asked to sacrifice for the sake of a flawless system? And what strange, desperate things might we do to feel human again? What is your verdict? Is perfect order always the enemy of human happiness? Let me know what you think in the comments below, and subscribe to unlock more of history's cursed chambers.